So welcome to this panel on the emerging solutions for municipal finance. My name is Eugene Drakkar. I'm the moderator of this panel. I'm a Detroiter by birth, product of the Detroit Public Schools and Wayne State University and its law school. I practice law about a block and a half away from this building. My wife and I are lifelong Detroiters. We never made it out to suburbia. We've always lived in the city and saw it in the best of times, certainly when we were high school students in the 50s and the early 60s, and then saw it suffer a decline in population and industrial base and tax base. And finally, 5 years ago, in July of 2013, saw the city become the largest city in the United States ever to declare bankruptcy. I had a role in that process. I was one of 5 mediators who helped mediate the creditor claims in the bankruptcy. And when we started in that process, I think none of us ever expected that the bankruptcy would end in anything less than probably 5 years. Certainly nobody thought that it was going to end in 16 months, an absolute record for something of that size and complexity. And since the end of the bankruptcy in November of 2014, there's been a remarkable transformation in the city. I see it every day as I drive down Woodward to come to work, and you see it not just on Woodward, but you see it in the neighborhood in which I live and in all kinds of other places in the city. For those of you who are from out of town, and perhaps have never been to Detroit before, I suspect many of you are amazed at what you're seeing. It hardly comports with the dystopian image that the city has had for many, many years. So we're going to talk today with 3 very knowledgeable people about the city's finances and business practices and development activities. And at the end, I'll talk for a few minutes about the bankruptcy itself, some of the lessons those of us who were involved in the mediation effort in the bankruptcy learned from it. And we're often asked, gee, can this apply someplace else? There are other cities in the United States, I don't have to name them, their names are all too familiar, who have pension shortfalls and retiree health care obligations that dwarf those of the city of Detroit. Is there something that we developed here in Detroit with philanthropy, help from the state and help from the Friends of the Detroit Institute of Arts? Can that be replicated elsewhere? We'll talk about that at the end. But to begin with, I think it's more important, instead of dwelling on something that's now almost 5 years old, to talk about the results of the bankruptcy. I think that's what's probably on most people's minds. And to start that process, I'm going to first call on John Naglick to talk a little bit about what changes have been brought about in the city's finances, from the obvious changes in its balance sheet to what the bankruptcy has permitted it to do, and what the post-bankruptcy future looks like for Detroit and its financial picture. John?
Thank you, Eugene. So I thought I'd start with just a brief walk back in history. Sonia Mays, who's on the panel with me, and myself both worked for Kevin Orr, started in 2013, so we were there during the bankruptcy, and so I just wanted to remind you of historically what occurred. So on July 18th, 2013, the city filed a voluntary petition under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. At that point, the city's accumulated unrestricted general fund deficit was $133 million. That was at June 30th, 13. And the city was utterly insolvent at that point, which is what led to the bankruptcy filing. Up until that point, the city's strategy for dealing with operating deficits was to issue long-term debt. Had city officials not issued debt, the accumulated general fund deficit would have been nearly $1 billion. So only in government accounting does borrowing long-term debt count as a revenue. So the deficit would have been worse if it wouldn't have been for that borrowing that tried to stave off the inevitable. And the first fight in bankruptcy was to be deemed eligible. So on December 8th, 2013, the bankruptcy court issued a bench decision determining that the city was insolvent and was eligible to be a Chapter 9 debtor. And it was a unique proclamation by Judge Rose to say that the court determined that the city was in a state of service insolvency as well as financial insolvency. Service insolvency is what occurs when a city has to dedicate a huge portion of its revenues to legacy costs as opposed to services to citizens. The tax-paying citizens don't see services in exchange for their taxes, so they exercise their right to move out of the city. I'm telling you what you probably already know. Detroit went from 1.8 million residents in 1950 to 700,000 residents at the time of the bankruptcy filing. And remarkably, the city had 2 decades that each had greater than a 20% decline in population. Legacy costs were consuming 40% of the general fund budget in fiscal year 13, and without restructuring, those legacy costs would have climbed to 55% in fiscal 14, and 58% in fiscal 15, and 60% in fiscal 16 and beyond. So our general fund has about a $1 billion budget. So I think it's remarkable to think that $600 million of our $1 billion budget would have gone to legacy costs. We had 3 times as many pensioners as we did current employees at that point. So the legacy costs were a huge overhang. As Eugene indicated, the bankruptcy went very quickly. We exited bankruptcy on December 10th of 2014, having achieved consensual settlements with nearly all of its creditors. So the reason a bankruptcy can go quicker is when there are consensual settlements. So the mediators and those that helped, and Eugene was obviously very key to that process, it was a very important reason that the bankruptcy was able to go so quickly. The bankruptcy plan of adjustment eliminated $7 billion in debt and unfunded liabilities. In terms of and you've heard a lot of debate over who took the biggest hit. Was it Wall Street? Was it pensioners and retirees? And I would tell you, my vote is, having been on the inside, I think pensioners and retirees did take the biggest hit, measured by dollars. We eliminated an unfunded liability for our retiree health care that was $3.8 billion. There were modest pension reductions. The pensioners largely kept their pension benefits intact as a result of the grand bargain that not only saved the DIR, but it also kept the retirees from taking greater cuts to their pensions. But the value of their pension reductions they did take by losing cost of living allowances was $1.7 billion. The pension obligation certificates that had been issued by a former mayor, those were reduced in bankruptcy, so that was a $1.3 billion reduction. And then the city had derivatives called the swaps that guaranteed the interest rate on the pension obligation certificates, and that was a $200 million hit. And most of those Wall Street losses on the pension obligation certificates and swaps were insured, and I'm sure Jed's going to talk about the options that were given to the big bond insurers, Syncora and Fidget, and they're now very much engaged in development in our town. So one of the ways Kevin Orr solved the bankruptcy at the end, when these bond insurers had to pay off on these pension obligation certificates and swaps, was by giving them options on city properties and giving them an ability to earn their money back if they participated in future development. The reductions, and again, very harsh, hard on retirees, but they allowed the city to restore basic services to residents. So police, fire, EMS, bus service, blight removal, technology, economic development were all things that were cut leading up to the bankruptcy filing in an attempt to balance the budget. So Sonia and I lived through this. We don't blame any prior administrations. When up to 60% of your budget is going for legacy costs, you just don't have a lot of room to operate. And in the state of Michigan, local units of government are required to have a balanced budget. Unlike our federal government, we're not allowed to run deficits. That's what leads to emergency managers in our state. So that was the reset of the city's finances that led to the resurgence that we're seeing in the streets today. The city has been under oversight by a state-appointed financial review commission since the exit from bankruptcy. The FRC, or the Financial Review Commission, was put in place as a result of the grand bargain legislation. So there was state law that was passed in addition to the foundations that contributed large sums of money to help the pensioners largely keep their pension benefits. The state of Michigan kicked into the settlement as well. And as we all know, when you get money from the state or federal government, there's always strings that come attached. And ours was oversight. It was actually initially designed to be 13 years of oversight. And our mayor was elected right about the time the bankruptcy was ending, or a little bit before. He was elected near the end of 2013, and so began his term in 2014. So he was our mayor during the last year of the bankruptcy. And when the state of Michigan was negotiating their payment of what they were going to contribute to help us exit bankruptcy, these public acts, Public Act 181 and 182, were put in place, and 13 years of oversight. And our mayor was the one that said, hey, at least give us the ability to earn our way out. If we can quickly get this ship righted and start running balanced budgets, don't sign us up for what we've seen other cities like New York, to name one, that lived through years and years of oversight. So the soonest we could get out of oversight was after 3 years of balanced budgets. I don't know if you saw the press on Monday, the Financial Review Commission met and waived their oversight of the city. And so now we're back to a city of self-determination. The FRC doesn't go away. They've only waived their oversight. And if we fall behind in any of the key metrics, balanced budgets being the most important, not making good on continuing to contribute to our pension plans and an irrevocable trust we set up to protect our retirees, the FRC could come back. Eugene asked me to comment, just the last thing I'll talk about is what changed in terms of city budgeting. And I would say the most important best practice that was put in place was to start every budget season with a revenue estimating conference. So this takes up a lot of time at the city, but actually twice a year we convene a revenue estimating conference, and it's not just those of us in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Our Legislative Policy Division participates, representing City Council. Our Auditor General's Office participates, and we start with an honest estimate of what our revenues are. In our state or in our city, our big revenues are income taxes are number one, state revenue sharing, our share of the 6% sales tax that we all incur when we buy things in the city is number two. Wagering tax is our third largest revenue stream, and so those are the big ones. But then there's a number of departmental revenues, and by starting with this honest assessment where everybody has to sign off on what the revenues are going to be, that keeps us out of trouble. We're very conservative with forecasting revenues. We're really excited, and Judd's going to tell you about all the economic development that's happening in our city, but we don't dial in future revenues into our 4-year plan. We stay very conservatively with what we see in front of us, and then we only appropriate expenditures against that revenue. So that's why we're so confident that we'll be able to continue to have balanced budgets. So that's the part I wanted to talk about. Eugene didn't know I was going to do this, but I want to show you this book. If you want to read more about Mr. Drakkar, Nathan Bomey wrote a book called Detroit Resurrected. To be resurrected is to have a second chance at life, and that's what the bankruptcy allowed the city to do. So if you're interested and you want to read more about it, this is a great book. It reads like a John Grisham novel instead of a biography. So I'd invite you to look at this if you want to see more about it.
Thanks. Thank you very, very much, John. It was very informative. Yes. May I make one comment about the pensions? When Kevin Orr, in the spring of 2013, this was before the bankruptcy filing, he put together a tremendously complicated set of materials forecasting what was down the road for the city. And his projection was that the retirees, approximately 20,000 retirees, would have to suffer a cut in pensions of 30%. 30%. About half those retirees were police and fire that had one pension system. The other half was what they called the general retirement system, non-uniformed employees. Well, you can imagine the reception that received among people. The pensions The typical pension for police and fire, I think, was $32,000, and for non-uniformed was $19,000. So the notion that was sometimes repeated in the national press that the retirees were getting enormous pensions was not anywhere near accurate, and these people were staring at a potential cut of 30%. Happily, that didn't come about. Let's turn now to Jed Halbert to talk about what's happened in the city kind of on the ground based upon the financial circumstances that John's described. Jed?
Sure, thank you. So I joined in May of 14, so I was also present during the bankruptcy, which, by the way, if anyone is feeling bored in their career, I'd recommend a large municipal bankruptcy, which will cure that feeling immediately. My concern at the time was less about how the bankruptcy gets exited. We had people on either side of me, among many others, responsible for that. It's where do we go from here? And I think about it in three different buckets. One, at the highest level, when you think about what's necessary to grow the city, first is just a feeling of confidence in the future of what's going to happen in town. And having the finances of the city be on a stable footing in a predictable way going forward, independent of any service provision or any other investments we make, that itself alone was a huge bonus for attracting investment into the city, whether that's real estate investment, companies willing to move their offices downtown, or residents thinking of moving into the city. The second provision, and John alluded to this, is from a growth perspective, it really doesn't matter how many tax abatements or RFPs you offer, et cetera. If all the streetlights are off, if the ambulances take 30 minutes to show up, et cetera, everything else you do is moot. You have to get those basic services to work in order to have a foundation to deliver. And thanks to the bankruptcy and to the operational restructuring, and of course, to we believe, the discipline of this administration, we've delivered those services consistently now for 4 years. So it's eliminated that question of, if you live in Detroit, are you making a trade-off with respect to the basic service provision that you would expect in a major city? Which gets to the third bucket that I'm responsible with my team in the planning department and the housing department and other arms is, what is the strategy to craft a stronger market so that people like Sonia in her new role running a development firm come do development, that the CEOs of businesses move their offices downtown, and that individuals feel comfortable renting and buying housing in the city? And it's not a rocket science strategy, and I think we've all seen this movie play out in other cities, that if you'd gone to Washington, D.C., or to Philadelphia or to New York decades ago, many people, completely credible people, would have said these cities are never going to grow. And they have grown a lot because there is a demographic and cultural shift nationwide towards urban living. And that shift was effectively blocked in Detroit for years for a whole host of reasons, including the basic service issues and confidence in the city's fiscal future that I mentioned. So our job is to create a great urban quality of life in terms of building a value proposition for people to move into town and developers to build. That takes public-private partnership investments, the city, the corporate community, and the philanthropic community operating together to build out the public infrastructure like parks and transportation, and to fund the catalytic projects that are the first ones to build density and fill in the spaces that were empty. That's the strategy that was used in downtown in the Woodward Corridor, and to be very clear and give credit where credit's due, it's a strategy that started before this administration. Investments in things like the Riverfront Park were happening well before we were in office, and thank God they were, because it made it a lot easier to build on that, to get growth going from there. And traditionally, public-private partnership in Detroit meant philanthropy and corporations pay for something, and the city is extremely supportive. It's the thought that counts sort of partner, because there wasn't the financial base to support a larger contribution. What has, I think, accelerated the growth downtown and has allowed us to take it out to the neighborhoods is when we do these public-private partnerships now, we actually have money to bring to the table. We can put city capital into the parks, we can put city capital into the streets, we can expand bus service and do all the things a city can do to create a stronger real estate market. In addition to working with our private partners to do what they can do in terms of providing more gap closing funds to enable more real estate deals to occur. So the sort of financial implications of the bankruptcy has allowed me and my partners in city government and in philanthropy and corporations to execute a strategy that has steadily increased the sort of value proposition from an urban quality of life perspective, and has resulted in accelerating development downtown as the investment responded. And also, really critically, we've been very focused on moving it outside of downtown as well, using the same formula that's been working to date.
Thank you very, very much, Jed. You're certainly quite accurate in describing just the change in the feel of the community. My view as a lifetime Detroiter is that the most important thing that has changed in the city, not the streetlights, not the new buildings, it's the narrative of the city. Right. It's how Detroiters are talking about themselves. We were totally dispirited for many, many years, and I think people have a bounce in their step now. And how the world is talking about it. I get publications from around the globe. Somebody sent me an issue of Popular Mechanics the other day that had an article about Detroit. I haven't read Popular Mechanics since I was 12 years old. There's an article about Detroit.
Let's hope there's a lot of 12-year-old real estate investors reading Popular Mechanics.
And National Geographic and the Toronto Globe and Mail and a newspaper from Manchester, England. And there's a buzz about the city worldwide that has really changed the outlook of the city. So now I'd like Sonia to talk about this from the perspective of somebody who lived through the bankruptcy, working on the bankruptcy with Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, and now has gone on to wear a developer's hat, and what her perspectives from both of these kind of bookends are. Sonia?
Thank you. I think the very first thing I'll say is under no circumstances do I recommend municipal bankruptcy or any bankruptcy for that matter. John did a really wonderful walkthrough of the history, but I have to admit it gave me a little bit of PTSD because it was it was really not a fun time in the city. So just by way of background and context, the way that I ended up working on this particular project in that moment, I had been working in New York as a Wall Street investment banker doing M&A and workouts, and when Kevin Orr was appointed as the emergency manager or receiver, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with him, and that led to me moving, boomeranging back home. I'm from Detroit. I'm also a proud graduate of Detroit public high schools, and it actually all happened really quickly for me, right? Like there was this moment. I love my hometown. My family is very similar to Eugene's family in that, with me as the sole exception, they never left Detroit. I have aging parents, and as I would visit over the years, it was pretty clear that Detroit was on a pretty steep decline, and it became really important to me in this moment as the bankruptcy planning was coming into place that there be a Detroiter on the team, and somebody who was really, I know how these big transaction teams get put together. I lived that life for a long time. But it was really important that there was somebody that could play a credible voice for people who had to live with the consequences of the decisions that were being made. So the whole experience for me was actually deeply personal. There were people in my close and immediate family who were retirees. And so I would leave the job and I'd have to go home and I'd get peppered with questions about what's happening to my pension, what about my health care, where is this going, and a lot of times I just either couldn't share the answers or didn't have answers, and so it was just sort of a pretty tough environment. And I think for me, because I never lost sight of the human toll of what was happening, I got really focused on like how do we put stuff in place that long term serves. I've heard the term legacy Detroiters as of late, but really serves the people who have been here and who shouldered the brunt of the downturn, and so that kind of became the context in which I tried to operate. There was, and I'll tell one quick story and then I want to talk about sort of the future, because I actually don't really like talking about the bankruptcy anymore. I really like talking about what's going on, because it's so much more interesting in my mind what's going on today. But I'll tell one quick story of when I sort of like really deeply embrace the realness of what was happening with Detroit's financial situation. I probably had been here maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and I was in Kevin Orr's office, and he handed me a cash flow statement. This is basically the city's cash projection, and I looked at it, and he must have thought I was an idiot, because I said to him 3 times, I was like, that number cannot be right. That just can't be possible. And what was going on in my head is, I was thinking about the people that I work with on Wall Street who I knew had more personal liquidity than the city was facing. And it was in that moment that I was like, and you think about like the workforce and people not getting their checks, and what does it actually look like if the lights go out, right? Like, what does that feel like in a city this size? And the enormity of it at times, quite frankly, was overwhelming. Now that said, it was a utterly fantastic and talented group of people who worked on this project. As a Detroiter, I stayed, and as a Detroiter, I sleep better knowing that folks like John and Jed are running the show at the city, because it was a group of people who were really thoughtful and intentional about leveraging that really bad moment into something that could be good for everyone. So in closing, I'll just say, I'm happy to come back around and talk about this. My personal path out of that moment it continued to really be about people. And one of the clear challenges as the bankruptcy concluded, it was pretty clear that downtown had a pathway, right? Jed mentioned this earlier. There was all sorts of stuff that was in place as early as like 2003, 2005. Little seeds, and they had continued to grow, and they remarkably grew through the bankruptcy when nobody knew what was going to happen. And so there was all this really good kind of like tissue downtown and midtown, and you can kind of see like where that was headed. But nobody really seemed to have a good vision for what was going to happen with the other 132 square miles of Detroit. And this isn't to say that we've completely figured this out, although I think in the last 4 years, this administration has made remarkable progress in putting a framework in place for real solutions. I decided to not to go back to the East Coast, and I started a real estate development firm that happens to be a nonprofit. And what we've been trying to do is create mixed income developments in parts of the city that have not seen investment in a really long time, but are places that have really, really strong legacy, culture, and have a real future if you can just put the resources back where they should be. So I think in closing, I'll say definitely don't advise it. I'm very thankful that the process was only 2 years. I believe the whole time it was just going to be 18 months because I wasn't going to survive any longer than that.
That's as good a reason to bring it to an end as any.
Yeah.
Let me say just a word or two about lessons that I learned from the bankruptcy that those of you from other cities may wonder, is there something here that can apply elsewhere? The bankruptcy presented itself as a financial dilemma. The only real assets that the city had was the art in the Detroit Institute of Arts, which had never appeared on a city balance sheet, so nobody loaned any money to the city based on that art. And Detroit was the only major art museum in the United States that owned the only city in the United States that owned its art museum through historical accidents that I won't bore you with. And the other asset, one day it was viewed as an asset, another day as a liability, was a Detroit water system. So the question was, the creditors were clamoring to do something with these two assets, especially the DIA. And there were 5 mediators, 4 federal present and retired federal judges, and me. I was the civilian, and I had the retiree issue. And when we got into this and started talking about preserving the DIA, a retiree, a woman who was a leader in one of the retiree organizations, got up in the first mediation session that I attended, 40 people in the room, and there wasn't a chair for me. I stood up for 4 hours. And she looked at me and she said, you know, Mr. Drakkar, I love the DIA and I love to take my grandchildren there. But as between having paintings on the wall for wealthy suburbanites to come down and look at and putting dinner on the table for my husband and me that's paid for with my pension, there really isn't a choice. That was in the first mediation session, and boy, that hit me like a hammer on my head. And I learned at the beginning, and didn't forget it till the last day, that this was about people. You know, Sonia mentioned that this was a people problem. You get so wrapped up in balance sheets and bankruptcy principles and so on. It was very much a problem of how people looked at this. And the retirees were angry, very angry, that they were being blamed for the city's bankruptcy. Again, the financial press talked about extravagant pensions and so on. From my point of view, they were modest, not extravagant. And until we could calm the retirees down and talk to them, when I say we, the mediators, till we could convince them that we were not blaming the bankruptcy on them, we couldn't get any place. And that took a while. Another major issue, another takeaway in this, is that the retirees didn't believe Kevin Orr's numbers. They thought the books were cooked. And this was a few years before the term fake news and all of this. Alternative facts became words of art. You know, we were still dealing, I thought, with basic concepts of reality, but they simply did not believe that the numbers that the emergency manager were presenting were real. And so that was another initial hurdle. So I came away after 16 months in the bankruptcy. I came away with 5 principles, each beginning with a C. These were my 5 takeaways from the bankruptcy. First, you needed candor on behalf of all the parties. Everybody had to agree to a certain set of factual assumptions. Then you needed some creativity, and that was Judge Gerald Rosen, the lead mediator, his brilliant idea of marrying the preservation of the art with raising money from the philanthropic community, with buying the art off from the city, and it hung on the same wall it hung on before, but the city would no longer own it, and raising money from the philanthropic community that went into the pensions and augmented the pensions. That creativity became known as the grand bargain. And you know, we look back at it now and say, how did this all happen? My God, this is the whole grand bargain, okay? This is a 4.5-page outline of it, dated November 12th of 2013, that I prepared after Judge Rosen hatched the idea, and we met with Miriam Nolan, the president of the Community Foundation of Michigan, and she kind of scoffed at us and said, this will never happen. But she invited 12 foundation presidents to a meeting in the courthouse on Election Day of 2013, and they all showed up. And we started talking about this idea and talked about saving the pensions, and that didn't seem to resonate very much. And then we shifted gears and said, talk about saving the art. Foundation leaders, there certainly are people who are interested in culture. That didn't get very far. And finally, Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, who had been in office about 4 months, brushed those 2 things aside, and he said, this is about saving one of America's great cities. So he reframed the debate that the mediators had spent all day crafting. He repackaged it in about 20 seconds. And the group around the table all shook their head, and in about 2 months contributed $366 million to this effort. And unless you think that there were great computer programs keeping track of all of this, this is how the money was. These were the pieces of paper that I kept in my breast pocket. And this one says 292 million, and this says 326 million. And I had a couple of empty spaces on this. This is how it was done. We were like people with tambourines on a street corner, We weren't collecting nickels, we were collecting millions, but it added up to $366 million. And then we went to the governor, and he came through with $350 million on condition that the Friends of the DIA raise $100 million. And God bless Gene Drakkar, the chairman of the DIA. He said, we'll do it, and they did it. So this was a creative and cooperative. So candor, creativity, cooperation, courage. It took a lot of guts from a lot of people to say yes to this. And so that was the fourth C. And the fifth C, I'm the son of immigrant Jews, and my first language is Yiddish, and there is a wonderful Yiddish term called chutzpah, okay? And it's a little hard to translate. It begins with a C, and it kind of means brazenness. And there was a chutzpah in the room to put all of this together in this way in 16 months that none of us could have predicted. And when I look back at it now, it seems kind of unbelievable. So that's my story, inside story about the grand bargain. Let's now open this up for discussion among all the four of us.
Since we touched on philanthropy, I just want to take one little turn here. The philanthropic community continues to support Detroit in a lot of ways. It wasn't just what they contributed during the bankruptcy. If you ever get a chance to meet one of our colleagues, Ryan Friedrichs, Ryan is our Deputy CFO and Chief Development Officer. Ryan works extensively with all the large foundations to fund the kind of things that Jed and his team are doing. So as Jed indicated, you can all see it. You've been here this week. Downtown and Midtown are just, really fun to see, fun to, go to places after work. But as Sonia said, there's a lot more square miles of Detroit. So the plan is to re-energize these neighborhoods. The mayor's vision is to create more 20-minute neighborhoods, much like Portland, Oregon did. And those 20-minute neighborhoods are centered where, when Detroit was in its heyday, it had many very vibrant neighborhoods that all had their unique characteristics. So the money that's going into development in those neighborhoods, it's not all bankable, as Jed would tell you, and it's what always amazes me about him. Anything big that comes to Detroit now, the capital stack is the most complicated thing that I've ever seen. And a lot of times, it's not just mezzanine debt that has to solve it, it's philanthropy. So things like the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund that have been established, philanthropy to help with the neighborhood development program. I'm the finance director, so I'm in charge of borrowing money, and I would tell you, I agree with Sonia, I wouldn't advocate bankruptcy. It's happened exactly once in the state of Michigan. In our state, you can only declare bankruptcy as a local unit of government if the governor allows you to, and no governor has ever allowed it until this situation. And I tell people I don't think it would ever be authorized again. The governor expects that when you borrow money, you're going to pay it back. And one of the challenges in borrowing money as a formerly bankrupt entity is that people don't trust you. Our underlying bond ratings, and we talk to S&P and Moody's all the time, and they're writing better things about us because we spend time educating them. Our underlying GEO rating is still a junk bond rating, so borrowing on our own credit is still not possible. When we do borrow, we have to pledge a revenue stream. We have to pledge income tax or distributable state aid or our street funds. So last year we borrowed $125 million from JP Morgan Chase to help with neighborhood development. But the neighborhood development that, seeing this future is really fun in Detroit. These neighborhoods will come back, and the complexity of what comes together is really amazing, and it wouldn't be happening without philanthropy. And if Ryan was here, he would tell you that what's changed with philanthropic organizations in the last 10 years is they're not just giving their money away as charity anymore. They want to see evidence. They want to see researchers that show, if I donate my money, did you do what you said? Our mayor is quite passionate about workforce development. I don't have to tell you, we're the poorest big city in America. The level of poverty is just devastating. Our level of crime is still too high, and we all firmly believe what the mayor says, which is the way to overcome that is to create jobs, create vibrant neighborhoods where people have jobs, and philanthropy is helping with that, with workforce training. The amount of construction that's going to happen in this city in the next 5 years is going to be amazing. The new arena went up on time, which was a construction feat in and of itself, but many developers, not just Dan Gilbert, are going to be putting up a lot of buildings. Our water department now has split into a Detroit Water Department for the city of Detroit and a Great Lakes Water Authority for the region. They have plenty of debt financing to do infrastructure improvements. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of construction in Detroit. And to make that actually do something for Detroiters, we have to train people to have those jobs. And without philanthropy, it just wouldn't work. The year 2024 would come and we'd be no better positioned. But to answer your question, I really feel confident as a pension trustee that we're on the right track. We're working on funding policies. We're studying actuarial reports to see what our options are, and more importantly, setting aside money in a rainy day fund so that we've got it when it's needed.
If I could just add one very quick
Go
thing
ahead,
to that to emphasize further what John said is, and because I think it's the right framing to think about the importance of growth in the city, because growth is not an end unto itself. Growth is a means to an end. And the ultimate end is the security and opportunity of Detroit residents. And yes, the fiscal structure that we set up is a currently sustainable one, but it's all the more sustainable, and we can invest all the more in neighborhood services and vocational training and everything else that the residents deserve if we achieve growth. And that's why that maintaining and accelerating this trajectory, not just in downtown, but across the neighborhoods, is really important to create the not just stable but growing fiscal base that can expand those services and preserve those expand and preserve the services for the people in the city.
Our school system, which 50, 60 years ago was pretty much at the top of public education nationally. It's pretty amazing to scan across Detroiters and see where some really prominent folks who are from here, that they actually were educated in the Detroit educational system. And so it was a system with a tremendous amount of historical success and legacy. The past 10 years, though, the preceding 10 years, the election was in 2016, but the preceding 10 years, our school system actually had been under state receivership. And so there was no functioning school board, and all of the administrative and operational decisions were being made by a state-appointed emergency manager. So effectively the same structure that was in place when Detroit filed for bankruptcy. This was what wound up happening in Detroit public school systems. And I should say, I think this is a really important contextual point to know. Our school system has always been separate from municipal government. So we don't have a combined system here where the mayor oversees schools. It's always had its own governance structure. And that'll become important in just a second. So to this point of bankruptcy sort of being an imperfect tool, particularly when you have to deal with the people aspect of a financial problem. The school system had close to $1.5 billion in debt, and the state and some local business and philanthropic stakeholders, really in a great parallel to what was done with the Grand Bargain, essentially bailed out our public school system a couple years ago, and control was returned back to an elected school board, and I sit on that school board. The reason that I ran, I made the joke about being idle. I was idle, but the real reason that I ran for school board is because two reasons. One is my housing work. It had become really clear in my housing work that there was this natural cap on what was possible in the areas in which we were really doing most of our work. And it's basically this idea that you laid out, right? Like, it's probably some, near endless number of recyclable young people who want the urban experience, and they'll move downtown, they're single, they'll get a studio or a one bedroom, they'll have a good time. But then the second they decide to partner and have children, then it becomes a really tough conversation about how do I make Detroit work? And the thing that was coming to the top, always to the top, was this question of how do I make Detroit work for children in their education? And so it quickly became clear to me that unless there were like real solutions that were going to happen in this moment of change in the school system, we ran the risk of sort of having all of this good work be weakened in some significant way. The second reason, and I made this case when I was running, is school systems are actually all of our problem. And for a really long time here, it seemed as though the quality and the stability of our school system was really on the backs of just parents. And I continue to make the case that a quality school system affects us all and benefits us all, and a poorly performing school system affects us all too. If I'm a business leader, I really should be thinking about where my workforce is going to come from 10 years, 15 years down the line, and the public education system is a really important piece of that narrative. For people who are concerned about crime, there's some non-de minimis amount of crime that really comes from young people who were not giving adequate options educationally early in life, and that leads to bad choices later. And so all of these things are connected, they all affect us, and we all have to care about them. So that's a long, meandering way to get to this point that I want to say, which is that is a vital piece. It is a piece that a group of people have really are really focused on and trying to put some of the same forward-looking thinking and interventions in place that the city has. It's tricky though, because the two are, in a perfect world, you'd actually want the two aligned. You want some really tight alignment between what's going on in city government and what's going on in the school system, and to be honest, we haven't quite figured that out. And then there's the other piece that we won't have time to talk about, and that's the charter school element. I said that I was actually on another panel earlier, and I told a group of people that our Detroit's most recent gift to the country has been Betsy DeVos.
If I could just
Last question. One more question,
Hey,
way in
Eugene.
the back.
Eugene?
So I just want to add one
Oh,
real
I'm sorry,
quick, 'cause
Jed.
I agree with you on the collaboration. I don't think you would disagree. It is, in terms of city-school collaboration, it is getting tighter. And I think thanks to Sonia and her fellow board members and the leadership they put in place, we're doing a much better job than we have in the past about lining up our investments so that they feed off each other and leverage each other, but there's definitely still room to go there.
This is not an environment where you can waste resource, right? And so many of our problems in the school system actually have pretty good solutions in city administration. Like, we have a meaningful transportation issue, right? And so there's who runs the biggest transportation system in Southeast Michigan? Blight is another place. Blight and the stability of housing is another place that shows up pretty regularly in our classrooms. And we can't solve those without our city partners. So it only makes sense, and it's good to know that we're finally moving to a place of alignment, because that's the only way it's all going to come together.
Yeah, the one thing I'd add is we're really happy to have Sonia and her fellow elected members in charge of the school system. As she indicated, emergency management might have worked really well for the city of Detroit. I mean, we were blessed to have somebody of Kevin Orr's caliber be appointed the emergency manager. The emergency managers in the schools did not have similar success, and the state allowed charters to come in with really no regulation and displaced what was once public education. So the turnaround technique that was used, and you've seen it if you look at other large turnarounds, the old co holds all the Detroit Public Schools debt that was run up during emergency management, and the Detroit Public Schools Community District now runs the schools without being burdened by that debt load. So there's really a chance, and what we're all really happy to see is there's elected leadership running the school board. As Sonia indicated, the current education secretary had a lot to do with, how to say this kindly, changing the environment for our schools at the time that they probably least could tolerate that.
I'll quickly talk about the vacant schools, like just 2 sentences, because I really think Jed probably has the better view on this. Completely unprecedented, the number of closed schools we have. There is no place else in the country that's had to deal with 100+ vacant schools. There is no model for it. It is extremely complicated. No one wants to take educational dollars to demolish schools. It is a huge problem that is still seeking a comprehensive solution. But the city, and I maintain that we should be in the business of educating. We shouldn't turn our school administrators into real estate developers or planners or anything like that. And so I think this is a big part of where this collaboration with the city is going to be felt most acutely.
Agreed. I mean, just conscious of time, it is about what I'd mentioned earlier about beginning to align these investments. So in the neighborhoods where we are striving to achieve growth, where we're investing in ways in the public infrastructure and in the catalytic real estate projects to achieve that growth, we're talking to the school system about how do you align their own capital plans around that. And we definitely don't have a tight strategy figured out. We're just beginning to have that coordination, but it's the right conversation to be having. I'd also say, and it's impossible to say without saying I'm discounting the value of schools, but I'm really, really not. It's essential. It is also worth remembering we've never had in America a time when more households did not have school-age children. So there is really a growth story to be told about families that don't utilize schools. Sonia's point that schools are relevant to everyone, I could not agree with that more. I mean, that is absolutely critical from a workforce development perspective and crime, et cetera. But I also want to say that there is, in every city that's gone through this, there has been started this cycle where, yes, you're trying to improve the schools, but a lot of the growth in the early years is driven by people who don't have school-age kids. And so I think we need to weave these things together to keep driving the growth in that demographic, while at the same time working as hard as we can on the schools, which of course is not just a growth story, it's a critical thing we need to do to provide service to the existing residents.
Yeah, and to address your last question, I'll put my faith in Jed and his group. When we talk to bond rating agencies, and if you read our Moody's and S&P reports, I mean, we've got again, a B1 rating is nothing to be proud of, but with a positive outlook from Moody's, the way that we have the rating agencies, even in post-bankruptcy, writing better stuff about us is to show them the future. When we do deep dives with the rating agencies, Jed and his group are a part of that, and I don't know how much he'll disclose today, but when you see the future, it's not all auto manufacturing. We had to get the rating agencies off the fact that the next time the volume of automobiles, goes into decline or gas prices go up and people can't buy pickup trucks, Detroit's gonna, as you say, get the cold or something worse. The diversity of economic development that he's building and working with the mayor, the people we're recruiting to town, we're taking advantage of the large tracts of land that we do have, which doesn't exist everywhere in an urban environment. So I don't know if you want to...
I mean, just extremely briefly, I think that's exactly right. There's much more diversity to the local economy than there had been before. And okay, if there's a national financial issue like 2007, 8, and 9, okay, that's a different story. If there's a recession, that is sort of one of these average recessions that comes along, not to say that I'm not worried about it, but I think we're really in a place to survive that, thanks to the fiscal structure of the city, increased diversification locally in the economy, and the fact that there's a basic value proposition to be investing in these neighborhoods. I wouldn't expect a radical change in asset prices in terms of real estate values, because it's all based on more fundamental underlying values. So absolutely still a concern, but not one to the degree that it has been in the past.
Let me, I think we're out of time. Let me just leave one closing thought. The most important lesson of all, I think, that those of us who were involved in the bankruptcy learned, and John talked about it in terms of the city now dealing with potential pension needs a decade out. They're putting money away now. That was not necessarily the way Detroit dealt with its problems in the past. For any city or any state or any other unit of government, financial problems, unlike wine, do not improve with age. And we learned to our great sorrow in bankruptcy that steps that could have been taken 10 or 15 years ago to stop some foolish spending of pension dollars by giving things like 13th checks when the stock market soared, the pension trustees voted to give an extra check each year. Well, they didn't give one less check in the years that the market was down. So every day was Christmas in the eyes of some people. That kind of unrealistic outlook and the failure to grasp with problems that are right in front of you created the situation that led to the bankruptcy. And if you're confronted with municipal finance problems today, burying them and hoping that some later administration or some later government or some later savior will deal with them is totally unrealistic.
Yeah, Mr. Drakkar, if I could just add one point on that. You all didn't get to meet John Hill, who's our CFO. He's in London today, and I'm his stand-in. But John Hill helped Washington, D.C. through its bankruptcy. And one of the things John Hill says is that the CFO's most important job is to help people see the future. So separate from our 4-year budget, which is extremely conservative, he's got a 10-year plan built that factors in all of what Judd's working on so that we can see the future. And if you've got enough runway to look at problems 10 years out, he can plan. My boss, John Hill, is a futurist. At the time the bankruptcy was going on, Sonia, Judd, and I might have been scrambling around getting stuff for Jones Day or the mediators. John Hill was always working on the future. What systems should the city be on? What should the planning software look like? So being able to predict the future is the best way to make sure you're going to be prepared for it.
Thank you all. We appreciate you all attending.